All right, today we're going to try something a little bit different here that we haven't used before. We're going to use, instead of PowerPoint, we're going to use Prezi. And it's going to look a little bit different here. In fact, I can already tell one of the things that isn't working is the picture in the front. But right behind here, creating the Constitution, should be a picture of a guy named Edmund Randolph. But I'll tell you about Edmund Randolph. On the afternoon of May 15th of 1787, Edmund Randolph was the young governor of Virginia. He got to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, and the young nation faced violence and lawlessness, as we talked about in our last section with Shays' Rebellion. And now delegates from throughout the states were coming to Philadelphia to discuss reforming the government. Randolph knew the serious task he and other delegates were about to undertake, and early in the convention, Randolph rose to speak. He looked squarely at the delegates and reminded them of their grave responsibility. Let us not be afraid to view with a steady eye the dangers with which we are surrounded. Are we not on the eve of a civil war, which is only to be prevented by the hopes from this convention? Over the next 4 months, the delegates debated how best to keep the United States from falling apart. In this section, you will read about the Convention of 1787 and the creation of a U.S. Constitution. So, in 1786, a series of events began that would eventually lead to a new form of government for the United States. In September of that year, delegates from 5 states met in Annapolis, Maryland to discuss ways to promote trade among their states. At the time, most states placed high taxes on goods from other states. The delegates believed that creating national trade laws would help the economies of all the states. Making such changes required amending the Articles of Confederation because the national government had been granted no power to regulate trade among the states. The Annapolis delegates, led by Alexander Hamilton of New York, called for the states to send representatives to Philadelphia. At first, many Americans doubted that the national government needed strengthening, but news of Shays' Rebellion in late 1786 and early 1787 quickly changed a lot of people's minds. Fearing that rebellion might spread, 12 states sent delegates to the meeting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Only Rhode Island refused to participate. So the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, as the Philadelphia meeting came to be known, were a very impressive group. About half of them were lawyers, others were planters, merchants, and doctors. 3/4 of them had been representatives in the Continental Congress. Many had been members of their state legislatures and had helped write their state constitutions. Along with other leaders of our time, these delegates were called the Founding Fathers, or just the founders of the United States. America's most famous men at the Constitutional Convention were George Washington, the hero of the Revolutionary War. He came out of retirement for the meeting. Benjamin Franklin, the famous scientist and statesman who lent his wit and wisdom. And one of our best delegates was James Madison, who had more than 100 books on government in preparation for the meeting. When Thomas Jefferson, serving as ambassador to France, read the list of delegates, he wrote, "It really is an assembly of demigods." Now, not everyone was at the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they were both overseas doing their diplomatic duties, but they wrote home to encourage the delegates. Others had a less positive outlook on the convention. Patrick Henry, for example, who had been elected as a delegate from Virginia, refused to attend. He said he smelled a rat in Philadelphia and tending toward monarchy. Now, the convention also did not reflect the diverse U.S. population of the 1780s. There were no Native Americans, African Americans, or women among the delegates. The nation's early leaders did not consider these groups of people to be citizens, and they did not invite any of them to attend. However, the framework of government the founders established is the very one that would eventually provide full rights and responsibilities to all Americans. So here is the house that they were in Philadelphia, known as Independence Hall. This is where everything took place, and it's still standing today, as you can see with the high-rise buildings behind it. So George Washington was the president of the convention. His job was to make sure that all of the rules were enforced, and if anything happened, it pretty much went through George. And later on, here's James Madison. He was he actually was the best prepared delegate at the convention. He spent lots of time studying, as we talked about earlier, read more than 100 books on government. And these guys were very well respected and regarded, and Madison was known as the father of the Constitution. This is also where we get our state capital, Madison, Wisconsin, from. Now, most of the delegates arrived at the Constitutional Convention without a clear idea of what to expect. Some thought that they only would make amendments to the Articles of Confederation, others thought they would design an entirely new plan for the government, but they all agreed that the government should protect people's rights. Back in 1776, many Americans thought that government was the main threat to people's rights, but by 1787, a lot of people realized that people often came into conflict and needed a government that could maintain order. As a result, the government had to be strong enough to protect people's rights, but not too strong to be controlled. So they definitely had a problem on their hands. This was a challenge that faced the delegates, how to set up a strong government but limited federal government. By May 25th of 1787, at least 2 delegates from each of 7 states had arrived in Philadelphia, and with 29 delegates in attendance, the convention was officially underway. The first order of business was to elect a president for the convention. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania nominated George Washington. No American was more respected or admired than Washington, and every delegate voted for him because of his quiet and dignified leadership, and he set a solemn and serious tone for the convention. At their next meeting, the delegates decided on the rules for the convention. They wanted to be able to consider all ideas and also be able to change sides in any debate. They did not want to be pressured by the politics of the day, so for these reasons they decided that their discussions would remain secret. In order to ensure this privacy, the windows in their meeting room were kept shut even though it was summer. Guards were posted outside the door, and whenever the door was open, the delegates stopped talking. With the secrecy rule approved, they got down to business. So they were very divided on what kind of government they should have. One group wanted to remain with a system of independent state governments, such as the Articles of Confederation. Another group wanted to create a strong national government that called for changes to the Articles of Confederation. Madison and Alexander Hamilton, another guy, they wanted strong central government. So the convention's goal was to try to create a government that was strong enough to protect the people's rights, but it wasn't too strong to be controlled. So we did have 2 plans of government that were proposed. The first one was known as the Virginia Plan. On May 29th, the delegates began the real work of designing a new national government. So George Washington recognized Edmund Randolph as the first speaker, and Randolph offered up a plan for a whole new government that became known as the Virginia Plan. Madison, Randolph, and the other Virginia delegates had drawn up the plan while they waited for the convention to open. This plan proposed a new government that would have 3 branches. The first branch of government was the legislature, which made the laws. The second branch was the executive, which enforced the laws. And the third branch was the judiciary, which interpreted the laws. Very same 3 branches that we have today. The Virginia plan also proposed a legislature with 2 houses. In both houses, the number of representatives from each state would be based on the state's population or its wealth. The legislature would have the power to levy taxes, regulate commerce, and make laws in all cases where the separate states are incompetent or unable. The Virginia plan led to weeks of debate because they had larger populations. Larger states supported the plan. It would give them greater representation in the legislature, and the smaller states opposed this plan because they worried that the larger states would end up ruling the others. Lots of different delegates voiced their concerns, one of which was a Delaware delegate named John Dickinson. He says, "Some of the members from the small states wish for 2 branches in the general legislature and are friends to a good, strong national government. But we would sooner submit or give in to a foreign power than submit to be deprived in both branches of the legislature of an equal suffrage or vote, and thereby be thrown under the domination of the larger states." So there's no question about it that this plan, like with Virginia, gives power to the states that have more population. Now, to counteract this, New Jersey delegate William Patterson presented an alternative on June 15th known as the New Jersey Plan. This one called for a legislature with only 1 house. In it, each state would have 1 vote, providing equal representation to each state. The New Jersey Plan was very similar to the Articles of Confederation. Even though the New Jersey Plan gave the legislature the power to regulate trade and to raise money by taxing foreign goods, it did not offer the broad powers proposed by the Virginia Plan. The delegates voted on these 2 plans on June 19th. The Virginia Plan won and became the framework for drafting the Constitution. So the New Jersey plan definitely gave power to the small states because no matter what size state you come from, no matter how many people are in your state, each state would get one vote. So during the rest of June, the delegates argued over representation in the legislature and emotions ran high as the delegates struggled for a solution. So in desperation, the delegates selected a committee to work out a compromise, and the committee offered the Great Compromise, which sometimes is known as the Connecticut Compromise. But this was the agreement that was used to solve the differences of the Virginia and New Jersey plan. So here we have people fighting. We have Uncle Sam here looking all mad, and here's a goofy cartoon of Barack Obama as a referee. But compromise needs to happen in our government in order for it to run effectively. And you can easily make the case that in 2014, a lot of our problems with government have to do with the fact that our leaders don't know how to compromise. So the reason it's known as the Connecticut Compromise is because Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed it. And to satisfy the smaller states, each state would have an equal number of votes in the Senate. To satisfy the larger states, the committee set representation in the House of Representatives according to state populations. More than a week of arguing followed the introduction of the plan, but on July 16th, 1787, the convention passed it. So we had a new question come about because representation in the House of Representatives would be based on the population of each state. The delegates had to decide who would be counted in that population. The southern states had many more slaves than the northern states, and southerners wanted the slaves to be counted as part of the general population for representation, but not for taxation. Northerners argued that slaves were not citizens and they should not be counted for representation, but should be counted for taxation. So that is why it mattered so much how slaves would be counted. Now, the way to count enslaved peoples would be determined by something known as the 3/5 compromise. Under this compromise, 3/5 of the slave population would be counted when setting direct taxes on the states. This 3/5 ratio would also be used to determine representation in the legislature. So in other words, every 5 enslaved people would equal 3 free people for the legislation or for votes in the House of Representatives. So in other words, what it looks like is for every 5 slaves you have, only 3 of them would actually count. Now the delegates had another heated debate about the slave trade. Slavery had already been outlawed in several northern states. All of the northern states and several of the southern states had banned the importation of slaves. Many northerners wanted to see this ban extended to the rest of the nation, but southern slaveholders strongly disagreed. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia stated that they would never accept any plan unless their right to import slaves would be untouched. Again, the delegates settled on a compromise, and on August 29th, they agreed that Congress could not ban the slave trade until 1808. Now, aside from delaying any ban on the slave trade, the Constitution placed very few limits on Congress's power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Most delegates were glad that Congress would regulate and even promote commerce. After all, commercial problems were the main cause of the Annapolis Convention in 1786. Southerners, however, did succeed in banning Congress from taxing exports because Southern economies depended on those exports, mainly cotton. The Commerce Clause also showed the shadowy status that Native Americans had under the Constitution. They were neither foreign nations nor part of the separate states. They had nowhere to go. So the Constitutional Convention continued to meet into September. On Saturday, September 15th of 1787, the delegates voted their support for the Constitution in its final form. On Sunday, it was written out on 4 sheets of thick parchment paper. On Monday, all but 3 delegates signed the Constitution. It was then sent with a letter signed by George Washington to the Confederation Congress, which sent it to the states for ratification, or another word for that is approval. So we look at this and we say, now what? The Constitution, which we'll find out in the next section, will be heavily debated before it will even be complete. And we get into a whole different conversation about a Bill of Rights. We have a fight between a group of people called Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but we'll look more at that next week when we get back to school on Monday.